Welcome and thank you for standing by. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. Today's webinar is being recorded and the recording is being posted publicly. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. Now I'd like to turn the call over to John Abowd, Associate Director for Research and Methodology and Chief Scientist at the U.S. Census Bureau.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Today, we are delighted to have Sally Keller and her team from the Biocomplexity Institute at the University of Virginia to talk to us about a 21st century census curated data enterprise, a bold new approach to create official statistics. Sally is the Distinguished Professor in Biocomplexity and Director of the Social and Decision Analytics Division at the Biocomplexity Institute. And I've known her for quite a while. She's also a past president of the American Statistical Association, where we crossed paths, a past member of the Committee on National Statistics, where we served coincidentally, and a regular participant in the JASON group, where we first met during her 2016 participation in the study of the potential for the 2030 census. So I promised I'd give a short introduction. So I have done that, and I'm just going to turn it over to Sally. Thank you very much for joining us today, Sally, and all the members of the Biocomplexity Institute team. Take it away.
John, thank you, and thanks to the Census Bureau for inviting us to do this today. We're very excited to share with you some work that we've been doing to create sort of a new vision for the future, potential future for the data infrastructure that surrounds the Bureau and federal statistics. I'd like to start by first introducing my team, or actually letting them introduce themselves quickly, and then we'll go into sharing with you the work that we've been doing. So let me start with Ken Pruitt.
Ken Pruitt was the director of the census in 2000 and is delighted to drop back into the census world as the decennials roll around. Thanks.
Thanks, Ken. How about John Thompson?
Hi, John Thompson. I was director of the Census Bureau from 2013 through 2017. I got to work with a lot of the participants in the audience, and I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Joe Salvo.
I'm Joe Salvo. I was the chief demographer for many years in New York City, and an applied demographer with a very local orientation that I bring to Sally's team.
And Sarah Nusser.
I am Sarah Nusser. I'm a research professor at University of Virginia and Sally's team, and I'm recently retired from Iowa State University, where I directed the Center for Survey Statistics and Methodology and served as their vice president for research.
Thank you, Sarah. Stephanie Ship.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Ship, and after a career in federal statistics, I joined Sally to create the Social and Decision Analytics Division at the University of Virginia, and I'm her deputy director.
Thank you. And joining us a little bit later will be Steve Jost, who many of you know was the former director of communications at the Census Bureau, and he's with Subject Matter. And then also Chris Barrett, who is the director of the Biocomplexity Institute here at University of Virginia and has had decades of experience in the development of synthetic data and massive simulations to use such data. So we are very excited to be here today, and we have been encouraged on this path by some members of the team that you just heard from today, as well as previous Census Bureau directors, and across the board, your colleagues that you know quite well are looking forward to the future for the Census Bureau that will reflect 21st century approaches, that will really put the country on the move, and capture that move will really take advantage of the complexity of the diverse needs of users and how do we meet that demand, and will be able to really look at the exciting future for the Bureau as we watch for the changes in society and the economy. And so motivated by these folks and many others, we've been talking to a lot of people, and we've been thinking about the future innovation for the Bureau for a number of years. And just to kind of lay the initial groundwork, what we've come to is that there's an opportunity for a pretty interesting paradigm shift for the Census Bureau, one that would shift the focus of the data and data products that get developed on very cross-cutting purposes and uses. One that really starts to use all aspects of the information that the Bureau collects through all of the different programs in the Bureau and beyond, to try to really understand some of the really perplexing problems that we are confronted with today under the many changing conditions. And so this is a paradigm shift that takes advantage of the good work that the Bureau has done through the focus on different data attributes and surveys, and now taking a cross-cutting focus on these purposes and uses. And what you see on this slide are purposes and uses that stakeholders have raised in the many conversations that we've had with them. There are driving forces behind today's innovations. The Census Bureau has a long history of innovation, but it's useful to take stock in what are some of the current forces that really are helping the Bureau look forward as it modernizes. First of all, it's enhancing the gold standard. The Bureau needs to remain a gold standard and foundational for all of official state and federal statistics. So whatever it does, it needs to maintain that, that value. It's clear that the traditional collection of data is unsustainable. We have diminishing responses to traditional methods. Everyone wants timelier, more granular and robust data. Protecting and securing the information needs to always remain an important component. And to overcome some of the challenges, the Bureau needs to be more accurate, representative, stabilize costs, minimize response burden. That's a pretty significant lift, but hopefully they're up to the task. It needs to respond to these conditions that are impacting racial and ethnic equity, address historical undercounts. Now, the good news is that the Bureau is already moving down the road to implementing innovations and modernizations that the vision that we're going to roll out for you today can take significant advantage of. So they're already making greater use of data the government collects, third-party administrative records, and there's a collection of enterprise activities, one of which is the unifying and integrating of their survey frames. So this brings us to introduce to you the concept of the curated data enterprise. And the curated data enterprise, it's both an infrastructure and a continuous evolving ambition that will enable Bureau scientists and other researchers to develop new measures and new things, to address these purposes and uses that I shared with you in the first slide. Now, as I mentioned, there already are activities going on in the Bureau that we're very excited about that can be leveraged and really form the foundation for the curated data enterprise. And most notably is the work that's going on towards integrating the 4 survey frames into a universal frame. And I would like to make a call out of thanks right now to colleagues at the Census Bureau who are both working on this frame integration as well as have been great points of connection between our team and the Census Bureau. And that's Deirdre Bishop, Michael Radcliffe, Lori Zaire, Caleb Curcio, Andrea Johnson, and Nathan Jones. And they've been participating in many of the activities that we've had, as well as providing us excellent feedback along the way. So this curated data enterprise, again, as I mentioned, it's an infrastructure as well as an ambition, and it will drive to exploit multiple data sources. And again, to address this issue of providing more robust, timely, and comprehensive measures about people, places, and the economy. Notionally, this is the framework for the curated data enterprise. And what you'll notice in this figure is that it starts with purpose and use, questions and working hypotheses that we would really like to bring data together to help address. And then there is the opportunity, the curated data enterprise needs to provide the opportunity for data discovery of different data assets and products that might be available, both internal and external, to the Bureau that could help address the purpose and use. And then the framework goes into some more traditional sort of data pipeline of data ingestion and governance, which would include privacy and confidentiality, the wrangling and fitness for purpose, data quality, coverage, all of these really important concepts, trying to capture that. Then many statistical models and analyses will come into play to help drive towards the purpose and use questions. And then you'll notice on the sides of this picture, which touch every point of the process, is communication and dissemination, both internal and external of the Bureau, and then equity and ethics, which will play an incredibly important role throughout the whole process of the development and deployment of the curated data enterprise. Now, what's important about this figure is that we are talking about curation, about curating all of these activities in a way that will be useful to stakeholders. And we'll talk more about that as we go. Little history here. John gave a little bit of the history at the beginning, and our discussion started with a question that John Thompson posed to the Jason Group in 2016. The Jason Group is a collection of scientists and engineers that gather in the summertime to address technical questions that bubble up from the executive branch of government. And John came to the group and he said, if you started with a blank sheet of paper, how would you design the 2030 census? I had the opportunity to co-lead this study with John Levin from Stanford. And with our colleagues, this is what we came to. We recommended that perhaps you'd actually organize the enumeration directly around people versus housing units, that you would make use of in-office enumeration. 2020, we knew that was happening, to even do more of that as you drive towards 2030. Recognize that you're going to need multifaceted strategies to find people that don't show up in office. And then why not think beyond the American Community Survey and the decennial census to actually thinking about a more comprehensive data ecosystem? Following that report in 2017, one evening in December, in fact, encouraged by John Thompson and Ron Jarman, we convened a collection of colleagues to talk about what might be innovations for the Bureau moving forward. How does the Bureau embrace the 21st century opportunities and technical opportunities? This included some former Census Bureau directors, advocates, other federal officials, some professors, some CINSTAT members. And at the end of this meeting, we agreed that there was room to try to develop an initiative that would envision a 2030 census. And we formed a working group. Ken Pruitt agreed to co-lead that activity with me. And this is the working group that began to convene and think about how to articulate a future vision for the Bureau. And this was the initial plan. Again, it was focused on trying to really take advantage of 21st century advances in technology, holding on to the fundamental responsibility that the Bureau has, as I mentioned earlier, that's really to enlighten the public about democracy, the economy, and society generally. The feeling was the time had come for some fundamental change around the decennial in the American Community Survey that could actually respond to the declining response rates, cost, and public trust. And that what we really needed to focus on was the fact that this is a national public good and is an information platform, not just the decennial as it responds to apportionment and redistricting could actually be developed. And you'll notice that this really anchored itself in thinking about the 2030 decennial, but this thinking quickly evolved. We received some funding from the Sloan Foundation to continue to work on this vision. And at the same time, it became apparent that the Bureau was starting some enterprise activities, which includes the integration of the frames that I mentioned earlier. And so that sort of changed the dialogue that we were having into what we now are calling the curated data enterprise, which is a much more comprehensive data enterprise that encompasses all aspects of the activities of the Bureau and does it in such a way that you could begin now to integrate these activities. We formalized an advisory panel, we had meetings, we wrote some papers that are now out on a website that I'll share with you at the end of the presentation. And we engaged with experts from academia and industry. And this led to our team that you have met today. And then late last summer, the Census Bureau came to the team and asked us to do two things. They asked us to take this vision and bring it in front of stakeholder communities and elicit their input on it, and then to synthesize that input and begin to develop a research agenda that could be implemented over the coming years to realize this concept. Some of our early discussions with experts where we asked them about how would the existence of the curated data enterprise change stakeholders' approach to their research activities? What would be the implications for all level of government and tribal areas? And then what are going to be the barriers along the way that we will hit in adoption? The advice that we were given is, first of all, there needs to be trust rebuilt with stakeholders. That partnerships are going to be incredibly important, particularly with local governments. And that data products need to meet users' needs at all levels of expertise. And that is going to be a point that is going to be echoed throughout this whole presentation because it came up with pretty much every stakeholder community we spoke to. There are needs from OMB, most notably a decadal budget. There are needs from Congress, which is to protect the Bureau from political interference. And stakeholders, there are also needs from them, and that is the notion that they need to acknowledge that there are trade-offs whenever new strategies are put forward, but we want their input and cooperation in making those choices. So this led to a work plan, and our work plan is pretty simple. It's to convene stakeholders into listening sessions and socialize the curated data enterprise and gather feedback. We have done a first phase of that I'm going to share with you, synthesize this feedback, and in particular, formulate what we call use cases to capture the art of the possible of the curated data enterprise and have that help ground some of the conversations around this concept. Capture concerns that are going to need research attention. Think carefully about communication and messaging. So we have a practice session of that today. Think about and identify internal and external infrastructure needs. And then finally, it's to develop use cases to help frame these discussions even further with researchers and experts and use that information to develop a research agenda. We spent some time thinking about stakeholder communities, and these are the communities or taxonomy of stakeholder communities that we've identified. Obviously, Congress and the legislative branch, research and researchers, and I should point out that these communities are not disjoint. They overlap significantly, but it helped us in our thinking about some of the tasks that the communities participate in. Public policy, those that actually support the development of policy, program development, and administration of those policies and programs. The business and commerce community that has value-added products based on federal statistics. Advocates coming from non-government organizations that are the ones that will be monitoring the differential impacts of anything that we do. The media and the general public. We hosted a collection of listening sessions that touched some of those user communities, some of those stakeholder communities, the research community, the business and commerce community, the advocates, non-government organizational community, and public policy community. We actually held a dozen 90-minute listening sessions where the vast majority of the time was listening to the stakeholders. But in those sessions, with the help of our geography colleagues that I mentioned earlier, We described the curated data enterprise. We shared with them the integrated frames program that again can form the foundation, almost a coordinate system or an organizing principle for all of this massive amount of information that could come together in a curated data enterprise. And we facilitated open discussions about the curated data enterprise as a future state. And we had pretty good coverage across the country of our participants, as you see in the chart. In these sessions, we asked a set of broad questions. What would people like to see measured that's not being measured or is being measured inadequately? I'm not sure how often we actually go out and actually ask our stakeholders, what new things should we be measuring? We asked what measurements need the authority of federal statistics as trusted indicators. And then we really wanted to hear what should be mirrored and leveraged into federal statistics from the private sector. And then we had a second set of discussion during the meetings where we asked very specifically what data the stakeholders in the sessions use. What do they think could be best incorporated into the CDE and what partnerships would be needed? And then finally, what benefits would they derive from the CDE? Early takeaways from those conversations. First of all, there was overwhelming interest and encouragement to proceed. This quote by Jack Dangermond was really captured a lot of what we heard, that there was a lot of energy and enthusiasm around the enterprise activities that the Bureau is starting. But in Jack's words that you take that coupled with the CDE concept and 1 + 1 = 10. Again, we heard that data products must meet users' needs and users' abilities. Products need to support federal, state, local, business, tribal communities. There needs to be a lot more flexibility in the using of data and data products. Data access and confidentiality is important to everyone. And there were a lot of sensitivities around the use of administrative and third-party data from the perspective of how well that covers the cross-section of the populations, as well as the availability of that information over time. So these are important points that we need to take into consideration as we start to develop research programs. We had a lot of fun about the art of the possible. In our sessions, we shared a couple potential future problem areas that could be addressed with the curated data enterprise, and elicited from the stakeholders what sorts of problems would you want to have the curated data enterprise help you evaluate, help you solve, help you understand. And this mirrors some of the purposes and uses from the very first slide. Thinking about use cases is really important for a number of reasons. First of all, it's going to be the best way by actually trying to carry out some use cases that we can understand what the needs are, what the capabilities are that the curated data enterprise will need to meet. And that'll help us identify research gaps that we need to address. It also gives us a great opportunity to appreciate how a curated data enterprise environment could address emerging topics. Very similar to how the Pulse survey, was able to be fielded quickly and help address questions and issues around the COVID pandemic. What you see on this slide again are sort of the wish list that we heard from our listening sessions of the topic areas that stakeholders would really like to be able to sink their teeth into much more significantly than they currently are. We also heard a collection of research topics that the stakeholders felt would really need to be addressed for this concept to become a reality. Curation. We have to curate across the entire picture that I shared with you earlier, the entire curated data enterprise framework. There's much more to do on data integration and linkage. We need to be able to take into account longitudinal analysis over time, and now we'll have changing data sequences. How does that get handled? And it will be more complex than some of the changes that we have seen in surveys over time, because we're talking about the integration of many more data sources. And we have to integrate activities, geo and cyber locations, all in a situational context. We have an opportunity to rethink access and dissemination models for data and data products, and that should be quite fun. Coupled into all of this is the use of new technologies to collect data. Can this all drive us to more timeliness and speed to market on data and data products? There's an opportunity to expand measures derived from ACS and other surveys by addressing low density areas. If we're using administrative data for part of the population, can we redeploy resources to be collecting data in other ways in other parts of the population that aren't well covered there, as an example? Partnerships will be very exciting, and they will be multi-way. Incentives will have to be defined for these partnerships. Privacy and confidentiality will be important and needs to be acknowledged that we have to address that in a very significant way. We need to reestablish, create, maintain trust in collection operations and data products that are produced. And then there are respondent opportunities to reduce burden, but there's also the issue that people do want to be respondents. And so how do we balance and address that? We will plan to take on some of these research topics over the next couple months, the ones that I've highlighted here. And what I'd like to do is to go into a little bit more detail about those. And that brings me to the second task that the Census Bureau asked us to do. So the first task on sharing the curated data enterprise concept with a collection of stakeholders, eliciting their input, and we have recently released a report that documents that process and what we learned from that. And I have a website at the end again that I will share with you where you can find the report. And so now we're moving into the second phase of the activities that the Bureau has asked us about, and that's to develop a research roadmap for the development of some of the initial research topics. And to do that, we will be convening researchers in a consultative sessions. We'll synthesize this brainstorming, and we will develop a 12 to 18-month research agenda for characterizing and developing the capabilities of the curated data enterprise. Some questions we will be asking researchers in these consultative sessions is what's known about the topic, and we'll be sharing 4 topics with you. What are some of the key research challenges? Who are relevant collaborators for executing near-term research programs? What researchers might be missed when we're sort of focused on a curated data enterprise as a concept across our stakeholder groups? What aspects of the research is the Bureau really well positioned to execute internally, and where would they be well positioned to partner through cooperative agreements or other mechanisms? So let me walk through the 4 topics that we plan to take on. The first comes back to case studies. Case studies, again, can form a really important mechanism to ground the development of the curated data enterprise. It can really exercise the aspects and capabilities that we want this enterprise to achieve. So the questions become, what should be the components of a case study that would meet those goals, that would really help with this development and be able to exercise the capabilities? Things like the relevancy of the research domain relative to purpose and use, feasibility of the CDE being able to actually be useful, the availability of multiple sources of data. Will the case study actually exercise and identify measurement requirements across multiple units of analysis and characteristics? across time and across geography? Will there be a collection of imputation methods, projections, statistical analyses? What will those look like? What kinds of partnerships will they surface that would be needed? Are there experts available to advise on this? And what are the curation requirements? So we need to define these aspects to help understand how case studies would be selected and how they would actually help the development of the curated data enterprise. A second topic is curation. And discussion topics for the curation discussion, see how many times I can say discussion in one slide. What are the general principles for developing standards? Standards exist in a lot of places, and I don't think that we want rigid standards, but we want to understand how standards are developed and how they could be applied in the case of the curated data enterprise framework components that you see here. How does purpose and use get captured in a curation process in a way that it could be, think of metadata, how would that apply to the capture of purpose and use? What's well known around metadata and PAR data that have been used to capture survey data elements that need to be maintained here and could be leveraged? You know, what is the role of non-survey data in all of this? What will need to be added? How does the quality evaluation in the curated data enterprise get captured? That's going to be extremely important, particularly because this vision allows for the opportunity that every data element has the opportunity to have its own source of information. So how are we going to capture that? And then what aspects of this can be automated? Because part of this, most of this will need to be automated at some point. So we will be holding sessions to brainstorm around curation and then bring forward a more comprehensive research plan. Access and dissemination. Again, this is a very exciting topic. You know, can we think totally out of the box on new opportunities for access and dissemination of data and data products? What would be the potential mechanisms? How do we take advantage of new technologies such as privacy enhancing technologies? Can we move beyond the RDC model? Can we move beyond tabular dissemination? I think we all think that we can. And what about user-defined data products? That's what we heard again and again, that users want to define their own geographies. They want to define categories, their own age pyramids. How do we provide flexibility for user-defined data products? Now, there will be forces that will need to be balanced when we consider the infrastructures, the technical infrastructures versus policies that could be applied. And then what about the role of open science? There's a lot that's been happening on open science as well as FAIR, data and services. This is FAIR as in findable, accessible, integrated, and okay, I'm missing the other letters that I'm sure my colleagues will help me with. Sarah, help me.
Interoperable and reusable.
Thank you. Very important. So the FAIR data and services, this whole area has really grown up over the last 4 or 5 years, doesn't have a role here. So these will be things we will be discussing with some researchers and experts. And then finally, data linkage and integration. And the Bureau has done a lot of work on this topic already through entity resolution, cooperative agreements, but there's more to be done. And in particular, we have to be considering many data types: survey, administrative, opportunity, procedural, third-party, state, tribal, local data, and the list probably even goes on. We need to really think hard about risk mitigation associated with data source availability. And that is something we heard loud and clear in our listening sessions. If we're focusing on purpose and use, does that change how we think about data integration and linkage? What's known? And what are the strengths and known limitations about the data sources? It's going to be different for each data source and each data type. So in addition to sampling errors, such as coverage and bias, what other components do we need to consider when we're thinking about quality metrics for the new data products and for the new data sources? What are the analogies to the wonderful work that's been done on total survey error? Is there a parallel here that we can develop? Again, I said earlier that stakeholders have expressed their interest in user-defined geographies and classifications. This is going to play into data linkage and integration. And then the Bureau is clearly committed to increasing diversity, equity, and inclusion. How does the curated data enterprise and this sort of massive amount of data linkage and integration that we're talking about help meet this goal or hinder meeting that goal? That needs to be discussed. So here's our timeline. We've completed the first phase of this work with our early listing sessions. We've developed a set of use cases that are really helping seed the conversation around the technical discussions, not just the case studies, but all of the technical discussions. We are now doing broader outreach, as in this talk today, and have had several other sessions internal to the Bureau and with other communities. And we are now embarking on the development of the technical roadmap for the CDE vision. We launched a website about 2 to 3 weeks ago where you can find the first report for the first phase of the work with the Bureau, as well as other materials, including a collection of use cases under the Art of the Possible, information of who participated in our sessions, and some early white papers about the feasibility of all of this that we have prepared. And with that, I am going to turn this back over to John.
Thank you very much, Sally. That was a very comprehensive survey of your work. And now the floodgates are opening with the questions, but I gathered two. I'm going to ask you the hard one first from the questions. Dr. Quincy B. asks, when considering historic distrust in hard-to-count areas, what administrative data are deemed trustworthy?
So, John, that's a great question. And I think what we need to think about is that it's not just administrative data that could be brought to bear on hard-to-count areas. So I'm not sure which administrative data might be most trustworthy there. That's a research question. And it's one that will be explored and will be proposed to be explored in the near term. But I think the thing to think about is that the curated data enterprise, with the opportunity to integrate all different data sources, allows for the opportunity to use something like administrative data for cross sections of the population where we know it works well, it has good coverage, identify where we know it doesn't work well, and then initiate other data collection mechanisms to get at those non-administrative hard to count areas.
Thank you. Amanda Klimek asks, I know that this was just recently released, but have you considered how the recommendation from the Census Project's report could be met with this effort? She provides the URL, but I didn't.
So I'm gonna punt that one to Steve Jost. Steve, can you make a shot at that?
Yeah, happy to. And apologies for being late, but I was wearing my other hat for the Census Project, and we were actually briefing Hill staff on that report. And I think the short answer is there's a great deal of cross-pollination between the Census Project and this project. Both John and Ken Pruitt are on the board of the Census Project. Ken led the effort that the Census Project undertook on their ACS review. Different oriented and setting the goals and the vision down the road. The Census Project is more short term in its view, and they're working on getting that the Congress to fund efforts like expanding the ACS, which will gird this effort. They'll be essential first steps for the CDE to become viable, although it's not dependent on that. You know, the Bureau has funding for the transformation, and this is all gonna move forward independent of that Census Project effort.
Thank you, Steve.
Thanks. We have a question from Donna Daly. What's the plan to reach out to data users in other federal agencies to collect information and insights from them?
That's a great question, and that is definitely something that we want to do, something that the Census Bureau wants to do as well. And so we've been trying to factor in what the timeline is for that. I will tell you one thing that we heard loud and clear from stakeholders across the board was that there are data assets, data products, and data sources in other agencies, not just federal statistical agencies, that are important to them and that they would like to see brought into this whole enterprise in some manner. So that's definitely on our radar.
Thanks, Sally. From Melissa Grant, greetings and a special hello to the team from the Biocomplexity Institute as a previous fellow and Iowa State University as a graduate. My question is, have you discussed how you would go about finding all the data that could be linked within the Census Bureau, given that there are so many surveys that are conducted beyond the census and ACS? There's a follow-up, but I'll let you take that one first.
So yes, I mean, and that data discovery, you know, the data discovery block on the Curated Data Enterprise Framework is a very serious activity. And so yes, we have thought about that, and we are working with our stakeholders and other folks that we'll consult with to help understand what might some of these sources be, and also how might you discover them. I believe that the work and the enterprise work that the Bureau is doing right now is going to make that easier. And what we're finding as case studies and use cases get discussed and developed, again, is this discovery of information and the massive amounts of information that's out there, both within the Bureau and external to the Bureau. And I would punt it over to Joe and Stephanie if you guys want to add anything to that, our leads on case studies.
Yeah, I'd like to mention that right now there's a use case on migration that we've developed. And there's activity within the geospatial realm involving postal records that the Census Bureau uses widely and needs to be brought to bear on the demographic frame or the demographic subject of migration, so that that data set could be used potentially in a model to develop better migration estimates. And the data right now is within the Census Bureau to do that. And that's a critical point, because the other part of this question has to do with this kind of cross-fertilization that needs to occur between different divisions in the Bureau, which is something that Ron Jarman has spoken about and Rob Santos has spoken about. So we would obviously encourage such activity. And that's just one example. There are multiple data sets externally that can be brought to bear on this, in addition to what I just mentioned, or even within the Bureau, the LEHD program that John spurred has information that can be brought to bear on migration patterns. And all of this currently is within the Bureau. And that's what's exciting about this. If you can bring this together, these sources together, you have a great foundation for better measurement, for, in this case, of migration.
And I would also add that I just dropped in the chat the link to the website that we launched. And on that website, you'll find some exemplars of Art of the Possible use cases with a window into data sources, both internal and external to the Bureau. as well as a link to some tables of data sources that came up during the stakeholder session. So it's just sort of the tip of the iceberg.
So Sally, I'll just add on another exemplar. Joe talked about the migration. We also looked at the gig economy, definitely more challenging there. But what we were amazed by when we looked at the nursing homes was just the abundance of federal data that are available that really focus on all aspects of a nursing home, from the residents to the workers to the owners, and how all of those are important, that if you could integrate them. And it's not just the data at the Census Bureau, but the occupational data at the BLS, amazing amounts of publicly available data at Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services, and then even data at CDC and smaller agencies at NIH. So there is just a wealth of data that, if integrated, we could tell this comprehensive story about nursing homes, which of course were highlighted during the pandemic, but also highlighted every time there's a hurricane or a weather event as well.
And then back to your original question, John, about how, just even within the Bureau itself, do you identify the potential data sources? That is one of the research questions that we'll be asking.
All right, there was a follow-up, and that was, if you work in a different area at the census, is there still a way to get involved?
I hope so.
They asked that question too, but that's what Melissa asked.
I would hope so. We are hoping that across the Bureau, folks will get involved. And I will say that as we start exploring the 4 initial research topics that I shared with you, the groups that we're bringing together will involve both people from the Census Bureau, internal to the Census Bureau, and external researchers. We do want to bring that together, and we'll be eliciting help from John, from Ron, from others at the Bureau in identifying who some of those participants could be.
Okay.
And if you're interested, just let us know.
Questions are starting to pour in now, so I'm going to get to them, as many as we can. From Kevin Shaw, have you identified any public-private entities that already do this curation and associate infrastructure very well that we might want to emulate?
So that's a great question, and we are exploring that. But yes, I think that Google, as an example, I mean, there are definitely private sector entities that are doing different aspects of curation that we would like to understand and leverage, and we will be explicitly reaching out to some of those folks.
Thank you. And from Bill O'Hare, I'm very much in favor of this idea conceptually, but I worry a little bit about implementation. In part, that worry is related to an initiative which existed from 2003 to 2010 called the State of the USA. There were a lot of meetings, including some at NAS, and a lot of foundation money, but eventually it died. Do you have any of the folks in this session remember the State of the USA and how it might inform this initiative?
Well, I remember it because, John, you and I were on CINSTAT when that was being discussed in detail. And so I don't really have an answer I don't know that I have an answer, Bill, to your question, other than I believe, because this is anchored so strongly within the Census Bureau as the foundation, that might make a difference.
Okay. Thank you, Sally. And Deirdre Bishop, for those of you attendees who don't know her, she's the chief of the Geography Division. She has offered to connect other Census Bureau employees to this project. So contact Deirdre if you wish to be more deeply involved. Question from Cici Villaros to all panelists. In thinking about the word integration, there is an opportunity to brand the Census Bureau so all our work is harmonious. This is not just census in terms of decennial data or collection, but rather a wide set from various censuses and surveys. How can we brand the Census Bureau to make it recognizable and trusted?
Well, that's exactly what we want to see happen with the curated data enterprise. And I mean, let me see if John or Ken might want to say something about that.
I had actually a promise to let Ken have a few words towards the end, so he can take that time right now if he wants. Go ahead, Ken.
Sorry, my topic is quite different, as a matter of fact. I just want to let the audience know that this is science, and in all of its dimensions and challenges and so forth. It is especially difficult because we're surrounded by a politics today that's unlike what we knew just the last census, let alone the census before that and the census before that. And what we will be doing, and I say that very carefully, because not this entire group will be involved. It will have to be a special subgroup that are brought together to talk about how do we protect the science from the politics as the nation moves forward in some really unexplainable, if you will, and certainly new kinds of conditions. The data are now powerful. We watching it play out in the electoral system, in which by manipulating the data, you can do a lot of leave a lot of sort of tough stuff out there unaccounted for. And so we'll have to do that on behalf of the census. It's not the task of this particular initiative, but we will get to that. And becoming, I don't mean we, the meeting here, but there will be attention to that in the years ahead. Thanks.
Thank you, Ken. Sally, would you like to make any final remarks?
I just would like to say that I would like to thank my team. It's been such a great group of individuals to work with. We've been having a lot of fun. I also want to thank the stakeholders, all of you listening, stakeholders, internal and external to the Bureau. People have been so receptive to talk to us and to talk at us, to talk with us. And that's really important. We hope that continues. And then I invite comments. I invite people sharing what they would like to see, what they're concerned about with us, so that we can be addressing these issues all along the way. And then I really want to echo what Ken said, is that our effort is about the science, putting the science first and really trying to drive this vision forward through the science to make a difference for all of us.
Thank you very much, Sally, and all the panelists from the Biocomplexity Institute project. We really enjoyed having you with us today, and we look forward to continued engagement. We're going to use the real as opposed to the virtual way of plotting.
That would be nice. Thank you, guys.
This concludes
Thank you.
today's webinar. Thank you for your participation. You may disconnect at this time.